4 years ago, AMD's market cap passed Intel's for the first time in history. The former underdog, worth more than the company that built the PC era. This month, Intel started trial runs on its most advanced chip process in a decade. But, to understand why Intel needs a comeback at all, you have to go back to a belief the company held through the 2010s, a belief that cost it a product generation, an Apple contract, and eventually, the most valuable chip company title. This is the hindsight. To understand the belief and why it held as long as it did, you have to start with what Intel actually built. By 2007, Intel was the most dominant semiconductor company on Earth. Nearly 80% of PC processors, the leading position in servers. The kind of brand recognition where Intel Inside was a purchase signal for people who had no idea what a semiconductor actually was. What did Intel Inside actually mean at a structural level? It was a claim. Intel designed its own chips, manufactured its own chips, and ran the fabs that turned those designs into silicon. And those fabs were ahead of every other fab on Earth. Now, that combination, owning both the architecture and the factory, meant Intel didn't just make the best chips. Intel controlled the process that defined what a best chip could be. The mechanism was called tick-tock. Every 2 years, a process shrink. More transistors, lower power. Then, an architecture update. Clockwork. This was Moore's law as competitive moat, and Intel ran it better than anyone. AMD was always in the room. Cheaper chips, budget PC makers, somewhere below Intel's attention threshold. You might ask, wasn't AMD a genuine competitor during all of this? On benchmarks, sometimes. On market share, OEM relationships, or server credibility, no. For 20 years, Intel set the cadence, and everyone else followed. The belief that crystallized inside Intel during this era was specific. Manufacturing leadership is the advantage, not one of the advantages, the thing that if Intel protected, would protect everything else. How does manufacturing leadership actually compound into market power? When Intel's fabs moved to a smaller node first, it could build chips with more transistors, lower power draw, and higher performance, at the same price point. That meant OEM laptop makers, server vendors, and enterprise buyers all had one rational choice: Intel. Think about it. The fabs were the source of a compounding advantage that reproved itself every 2 years, like interest on a very large deposit. Any lead in the fab translated directly into a lead on the shelf. In 2009, AMD made a move that looked like a concession. It spun off its manufacturing division into a separate company called Global Foundries. AMD would now be fabless, relying entirely on outside foundries rather than owning its manufacturing. At the time, most of the industry read this as retreat. AMD couldn't sustain the capital investment. It was walking away from the one thing that actually mattered. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. Spinning off the fabs freed AMD to focus its entire budget on architecture. It stopped trying to compete with Intel's factory and started competing with Intel's engineers. That's a different race, one AMD had a shot at winning. The move looked like weakness. It was the beginning of the bet. Which is why what happened between 2016 and 2019 wasn't just a technical delay. It was a decision that kept being made. In 2016, Intel did something it had never done before. It broke tick-tock. The 2-year cadence that had been Intel's competitive clock since 2007, they replaced it with a 3-step model. Process, then architecture, then optimization. The announcement was careful. The message was not. Why does that matter? Because Intel's entire market position was built on the assumption that its process nodes would always lead. When the cadence slowed, owning both design and manufacturing stopped being an accelerator and became a constraint. Whatever slipped in the fab held back every product downstream. The fabs were no longer the moat. They were the chain. And to be clear, there's nothing surprising about a constraint becoming a chain. What's surprising is how long it took everyone, including Intel, to say that out loud. Here's the question that probably occurred to everyone watching this. Why didn't Intel just use TSMC? AMD was building toward exactly that. Why not rent the same foundry access? The answer is, what makes this an institutional blindness story rather than a technical setback. This next part sounds invented. It isn't. Intel's manufacturing credibility was its competitive claim. Using TSMC would have been an admission that someone else's fabs were better. That's not a procurement decision. It's an identity crisis. And so Intel's leadership kept scheduling product generations around a process recovery that kept sliding right. Meanwhile, AMD had been executing. Lisa Su had reorganized the company around one thing: a new CPU architecture called Zen, disciplined roadmap, no distractions. When global foundries stopped chasing leading-edge nodes in 2018, AMD moved the advanced work to TSMC, the exact foundry Intel had declined to use. So how was that going? In 2019, AMD launched Ryzen 3000 Zen 2 on TSMC's 7nm process. Intel was still shipping on 14nm. And then it gets worse. The 2019 moment matters because it was the first time in decades that a head-to-head comparison put AMD ahead on process node. Intel had 14nm, AMD had 7nm. That's not just a performance gap, that's a manufacturing credibility gap. And the people who noticed first weren't consumers. They were the server procurement teams at Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, buying chips in quantities measured in hundreds of thousands. How did Intel's process delay translate into actual market pressure? Each generation that slipped, Intel's products competed at a disadvantage in the one dimension its brand had promised to own. Data center customers started qualifying AMD EPYC. OEMs started asking about supply alternatives. The damage wasn't dramatic. It was actuarial, the quiet spreadsheet kind that doesn't look like a crisis until suddenly it is. Then, on July 23, 2020, Intel CEO Bob Swan told investors that the company's 7nm CPU schedule had slipped by roughly 6 months, and that the process itself was trending about a year behind its original yield targets. The earnings call transcript is public. The words are right there. The same period AMD was shipping on TSMC 7nm and planning to move to 5nm. You might be wondering, wasn't this also the year Apple left Intel? In June 2020, Apple announced the Mac transition to Apple Silicon, ARM-based chips, designed in Cupertino, manufactured by TSMC. Losing Apple wasn't the thing that broke Intel's business, it was the thing that broke Intel's story. The world's most design-conscious hardware company had decided Intel was no longer the default answer for high-performance compute. So where did all of this land? February 2022, AMD's market capitalization passed Intel's for the first time in the company's shared history. The underdog, the budget chipmaker Intel had kept below its attention threshold for 20 years, was now worth. And that's not a market story. That's a story about what people believe when they've been right for a very long time. Here's what really happened. Intel's engineers were not incompetent. The people who kept pushing for process recovery weren't wrong to try. But the leadership team that kept building 5-year roadmaps around the fabs will catch up was making a specific kind of mistake, one that shows up in every company that has been dominant long enough to confuse cause with identity. Why couldn't Intel just change course? Because Intel's manufacturing identity wasn't a strategy they were executing. It was a story they were telling to their customers, their investors, their engineers, and themselves. You cannot quietly stop telling a story you've been telling for 40 years. You can only tell it louder and longer and more expensively until the evidence is impossible to ignore. Intel didn't lose because it was out-engineered. It lost because the people running it confused. It lost because the people running it confused this has always been our advantage, with this will always be our advantage. And this is the moment I want you to remember. Those sentences look identical from the inside. And to be clear, that's not a character flaw. That's how institutional belief works. The stronger the identity, the more expensive the first admission that the identity is wrong. Lisa Su didn't need to beat Intel at its own game. She needed AMD to stop pretending it had to. Which brings us back to this month. What does Intel's 18AP entering trial production actually mean? It means Intel is attempting the hardest thing a company in this position can do, rebuilding trust in a roadmap after a decade of slipped roadmaps. The node doesn't need to be the best in the world. It needs to ship when Intel says it will. Because the product isn't the chip anymore. The product is the schedule. And that is the one thing Intel's manufacturing leadership used to guarantee. It's also the one thing it has spent the last decade trying to earn back. If this is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe. There's a new one every week.